All right, here we are. We have a brand new series that we're starting today, 1st and 2nd Kings for Beginners, subtitled The Kings Who Ruled and Ruined Israel. This is the first lesson in this series, lesson number 1, entitled Solomon's Glory and Fall. And we will be reviewing 1 Kings chapters 1 to 11. Before I start doing the book, I want to remind everybody who's planning to take this course about the workbook. There is a workbook that accompanies each one of our series, and I do encourage you to get that workbook. It'll help you to take notes. We provide maps and all kinds of interesting additional material that will help you as you take this particular course. I think you can just order it on Amazon or go to the BibleTalk.tv website and go to this particular course, and it'll give you information on how you can get the workbook. All right, so let's begin with our introduction, shall we? The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel chronicle the transition of Israel from a loose confederation of tribes to a united kingdom under a central monarchy. Now, these books detailed the rise and the fall of key figures like the prophet Samuel, King Saul, and King David, highlighting themes of leadership and covenant and divine intervention. Samuel serves as the last judge and the anointer of kings, while Saul's tragic reign and David's complex legacy shape Israel's early monarchy. As 2 Samuel, the book of 2 Samuel, as it closes with the reign of David, and we see both his triumphs, his personal failures, and also setting the stage for the next generation of rulers. This natural progression leads us into the books that we'll study now, 1st and 2nd Kings, where the focus shifts to the reign of David's successors. So we begin with a little bit of background on these books. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings continue the historical narrative of Israel's monarchy, beginning with the reign of Solomon and tracing the division of the kingdom into Israel, which would become the northern kingdom, and Judah, which would become the southern kingdom. They culminate in the fall of both of these kingdoms, with Israel conquered by Assyria in 722 BC and Judah by the kingdom of Babylon in 586 BC. Traditionally, the authorship is attributed to a prophet or a group of prophets, though some scholars suggest that it may have been compiled by editors during the Babylonian exile. Key theological themes include the covenant faithfulness of God, the consequences of idolatry and disobedience, the role of prophets in calling kings and people to repentance, and of course the sovereignty of God over the history of mankind. And so we begin with Solomon's rise to power, and the details for this are in 1 Kings chapters 1 to 3. So let's begin with a review of Solomon's rise to power. As King David grew old and weak, his son Adonijah declared himself king without David's approval. He gathered support from key figures like Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar, the priest, and held a banquet to celebrate his self-proclaimed kingship. At this point, Nathan the prophet, aware of Adonijah's plot, approaches Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, urging her to remind David of his promise that Solomon would be succeeding him as king. And so together they informed David of Adonijah's actions and asked him to publicly affirm Solomon as the correct heir to the throne. Upon hearing the news, David immediately ordered that Solomon be anointed king. And so Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah led Solomon to be anointed at Gihon. Solomon was then declared king, and the people rejoiced greatly, causing a loud celebration throughout the city of Jerusalem. Hearing the news of Solomon's anointing, Adonijah and his supporters became fearful. Adonijah sought refuge by grasping the horns of the altar in the temple. And Solomon, showing mercy, allowed Adonijah to live on the condition that he prove himself loyal to Solomon's rule. Before his death, David gave Solomon instructions regarding how to lead the kingdom faithfully according to God's law. He also advised Solomon on matters of justice, particularly concerning Joab, Shimei, and others who had wronged David during his rule. After David's death, Solomon's reign began and his kingdom was firmly established. Solomon solidified his reign by dealing with the potential threats. He executed Adonijah after Adonijah requested to marry Abishag, David's former attendant, a move interpreted as a power play for the throne. We read about that in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 13 to 25. Solomon also removed Abiathar from the priesthood and ordered the execution of Joab for his past crimes. And then finally, Solomon dealt with Shimei, who violated an oath securing his control over the kingdom. Solomon also made alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and married his daughter in chapter 3, verse 1. Shortly after, Solomon traveled to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, and while he was there, God appeared to him in a dream and offered to grant him any request. Solomon humbly asked for wisdom to govern the people. Pleased with Solomon's request, God granted him wisdom, wealth, and honor, promising him a long life if he followed God's commands. Solomon's wisdom became evident in the famous case of the two women who claimed to be the mother of the same child. Solomon proposed to divide the living child in two, revealing the true mother by her willingness to give up the child in order to save his life. This judgment demonstrated Solomon's God-given wisdom, causing the people of Israel to revere him. Now there's one question that comes out of these stories that I've given you, and it's about Abishag. Why would asking to have Abishag as wife be interpreted as a power grab for the throne? The answer to that is the following. In the cultural context of ancient Israel, asking for the hand of a former king's concubine or attendant was seen as more than just a personal request. It carried political implications. Concubines were often considered part of the royal household, and having access to them could symbolize a claim to the king's power and the king's authority. In the case of Abishag, who had been David's attendant, Adonijah's request to marry her in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 13 to 25, could be interpreted as an attempt to strengthen his claim to the throne, especially since he had previously attempted to declare himself king. And so by seeking to marry someone so closely associated with David, Adonijah could have been perceived as trying to position himself as David's successor, indirectly challenging Solomon's legitimate rule. And of course, Solomon, recognizing this political maneuver, saw it as a renewed attempt by Adonijah to undermine his reign, and therefore responded by ordering his execution, solidifying his authority as king. The next section of 1 Kings, chapters 4 to 8, deal with the building of the temple. This chapter lays the groundwork for Solomon's successful reign. Solomon, known for his wisdom, organizes his kingdom in a very efficient manner. He has an administrative structure. He appoints officials to manage various regions of Israel and oversee government functions, ensuring stability and prosperity. Israel then enjoys a time of peace and abundance under Solomon. His wisdom is recognized by nations far and wide, and his reign is marked by prosperity for his people. Israel's borders are vast, and Solomon rules over many nations that bring him tribute, allowing Israel to flourish as a nation. In chapter 5, we read about the preparation of the temple. It details the preparations that Solomon made in order to build the temple, which was the central project of his reign. Some of the things that he did, he made an alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre. Solomon forms an alliance with him in order to supply cedar and cypress wood from Lebanon. Hiram's skilled craftsmen also contributed to the building project, and in the slide you see the picture of the logs. This is how the logs were transported in those days. They were cut down and organized in such a way, and they were floated along the shore of the Mediterranean from north to south, and then were taken ashore in order to be used to build for the temple. In chapter 6, the building of the temple begins in earnest, following specific instructions regarding its dimensions and its designs. Now we have some pictures here that we're showing you to give you kind of an idea. Let's remember that these are artists' renderings of these things, to try to give us an idea of what they may have looked like. As far as the structure is concerned, the temple was built according to precise measurements. It was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. In feet, that would be 90 by 30 by 45 feet. The inner sanctuary, also called the most holy place, is where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant was stationed inside the tabernacle, the tent, at that time before the permanent temple was built. The temple is adorned with elaborate carvings of cherubim, palm trees, open flowers. The walls are overlaid with gold, giving the temple a majestic appearance. It takes 7 years to complete the construction of the temple, a symbol of Israel's devotion to God. In chapter 7, we have more information about additional buildings and furnishings. Solomon's palace. Solomon also constructs a royal palace complex, which takes 13 years to complete. This includes the Hall of Justice and a special house for Pharaoh's daughter, which he married. The chapter also details the craftsmanship of Hiram from Tyre, who creates many of the temple's furnishings, including the two bronze pillars named Yakin and Boaz, the bronze sea, a large basin for ritual washing, and various other utensils used for worship. The detailed description of the craftsmanship shows the immense care and skill involved in creating objects for worship, emphasizing the sacredness of the temple. In chapter 8, we read about the dedication of the temple, which was the climax of Solomon's efforts, a grand ceremony that marked the fulfillment of God's promises. Solomon gathers all the leaders of Israel to bring the Ark of the Covenant from the city of David to the temple. The Ark is placed in the most holy place beneath the wings of the cherubim. As the priests leave the holy place, a cloud fills the temple, signifying the presence of God. Solomon recognizes this as the fulfillment of God's promise to dwell among his people. A reenactment, if you wish, of what took place in the desert. In the desert, it was the cloud, God's presence, by day, and it was a pillar of fire by night that guided the people for 40 years throughout the desert. And so now when the temple is built, the cloud, which was a symbol of the presence of God, now the cloud appears in the temple to demonstrate God's blessing on their work and the fact that He was present with His people, among His people in the temple. And so Solomon prays a heartfelt prayer acknowledging God's faithfulness to Israel. He asks for God's continued presence and protection, praying that the temple would be a place where the people can seek forgiveness, mercy, and justice. Solomon also offers sacrifices, and a grand feast is held for all of Israel. The dedication ceremony lasts for 14 days, marking a significant moment in Israel's history as the temple becomes the center of worship for the nation. This is a high point, very high point in the history of the Jews. So another question that comes when we read about all the sacrifices that were made is this: did they actually sacrifice the thousands of animals recorded at the dedication of the temple, or was there a method of substitution? Is there any information as to how this was carried out given the time and the manpower that was available? Well, the account of Solomon's dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 62 and 3 records a massive number of animal sacrifices. It says 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats were sacrificed. This raises understandable questions about how such a vast number of sacrifices could be practically carried out in terms of time and manpower and ritual requirements. And so in answer to that question, here are some points that provide context and possible explanations for how this might have been managed. First of all, the dedication ceremony lasted for 14 days. Spreading the sacrifices over this extended period of time would make it more feasible to manage such a large number of offerings. This would mean that not all the animals were sacrificed on a single day, but rather across a 2-week period during the festival. Another point: while the temple had a main altar for sacrifices, it is possible that additional altars were temporarily set up to accommodate the large volume of sacrifices. Also, there was a large number of priests involved in the rituals. According to 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 11, all the priests present sanctified themselves for this event, indicating a larger than usual priestly workforce. Given that Israel had 24 divisions of priests, many of whom would have been on duty for such a major national event, this would have greatly increased the manpower available to carry out this great number of sacrifices. They had the people on hand. In 2 Chronicles 7:7, it says that Solomon, quote, consecrated the middle part of the courtyard to offer additional sacrifices because the bronze altar was too small to handle all the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the fat of the fellowship offerings. This suggests that alternative arrangements were made to handle the sheer volume of sacrifices made. Then we go to the types of offerings and the division of labor. Not all animals would have been sacrificed, as I mentioned before, on the same day. Different kinds of offerings, for example, burnt offerings, fellowship offerings, sin offerings, they had different ritual procedures. For example, if you offered a burnt offering, the entire animal would be consumed by fire. If you were offering a fellowship or a peace offering, only certain parts of the animal, the fat and the internal organs, were burned on the altar, while the rest was eaten by the priests and the people. Leviticus chapter 3 teaches that. The fellowship offerings especially involved the community in feasting, which would have allowed for more people to participate and reduce the workload on the priests. Another thing we need to consider are symbolic numbers. In the ancient Near East, large numbers in ceremonial contexts were sometimes used symbolically. While the numbers recorded in 1 Kings 8 may reflect the actual scale of the event, they might also emphasize the grandeur and the significance of the dedication rather than be strictly literal. This was a monumental event, and hyperbolic numbers were often employed in ancient texts to convey importance, like we think about the 1,000-year reign in the New Testament. It doesn't mean 1,000 years, but a quality of time, a quantity of time. Anyway, it's the same idea in the Old Testament. They also used symbolism with numbers. There was also the method of sacrificing. The sacrifices themselves could have been carried out efficiently through the division of labor. The priests and the Levites would have been well practiced in performing the necessary rituals. Given the scale of the event and the potential additional altars, the process would have been highly organized, with different groups handling specific tasks. For example, there were some who were there to slaughter the animals, others were preparing it, then others were making the actual sacrifice on the altar. There was communal feasting. The sacrificed animals were not wasted. The meat from fellowship and peace offerings would have been shared among the people, providing food for thousands of Israelites who attended the ceremony. This communal feasting was a central part of Israelites' worship, especially at such significant events. The large number of sacrifices would have provided food for a vast number of participants over a 2-week period. And so, while the exact logistics of how such a large number of sacrifices were carried out is not detailed, the extended time frame, the use of multiple altars, the involvement of many priests, and the community's participation in the feasting make the account more plausible. One other note is that scholars estimate that there was an attendance of about 100 to 300,000 people for this particular event. As we go into chapter 9, we read about God's second appearance to Solomon and of course more of his building projects. After completing the temple and his palace, Solomon receives a second appearance from the Lord, who reiterates both his promise, but this time adds a warning. God reaffirms the covenant, promising to bless Solomon and his descendants if they remain faithful and walk in his ways. However, God also warns Solomon that if he or his people turn to idolatry, Israel will be cut off, and the temple that they've built over all these years will be destroyed. Solomon continues his massive building campaign, excuse me, and he fortifies cities. He builds a fleet of ships. He enhances the infrastructure of his kingdom. Solomon continues his alliance with Hiram, supplying him with cities in Galilee in exchange for building materials. And of course, we read later on, Hiram's dissatisfaction with these cities gives us a little hint at growing strains in foreign relations that Solomon is starting to have at this point in his reign. Chapter 10 talks about Solomon's wealth, his extraordinary wealth, his international fame, and his relationships with foreign powers. But it also sets the stage for his eventual downfall. The Queen of Sheba, we see on the map where Sheba is located there. The Queen of Sheba visits Solomon, attracted by his wisdom and the prosperity of his kingdom. She brings gifts of gold and spices and special stones. And after testing Solomon's wisdom and seeing the wealth of his court, she praises God and Solomon for the prosperity of Israel. Solomon acquired 666 talents of gold annually, a symbol of his wealth and power. That would be like $1,350 million in today's gold prices. He constructs a magnificent throne of ivory overlaid with gold and surrounds himself with sheets of gold. We read about that in 1 Kings chapter 10, 14 to 22. He imports horses and chariots from Egypt, establishing a powerful military force. And so Solomon establishes alliances with various foreign nations, including Egypt, through marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, and he builds a vast network of influence. These alliances lead to the influx of foreign religious practices into Israel, and there is the reason for the warning that God was giving to Solomon about falling away from the faith. In chapter 11, we read about Solomon's idolatry and downfall. His wealth, his many marriages and alliances with foreign powers ultimately lead to his spiritual and his political decline. Solomon marries 700 wives and has 300 concubines, many of whom are from foreign nations. These marriages were likely politically motivated, aimed at securing alliances with surrounding nations. However, they also become a source of great spiritual danger. As Solomon grows older, his foreign wives eventually turn his heart away from the Lord. And amazingly, he begins to worship and build high places for foreign gods like Ashtoreth and Molech and Chemosh, gods of the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Sidonians. His idolatry leads to Israel's spiritual decline. God becomes angry with Solomon for breaking his covenant and commands, especially after God had appeared to him twice. As punishment, God declares that the kingdom will be torn from Solomon's descendants, though not during Solomon's lifetime, for the sake of God's promises to David. Instead, the kingdom will be divided after Solomon's death, with only a portion remaining under his son's control. And so, as Solomon's reign progresses, God raises up adversaries to challenge his rule, foreshadowing the instability that will follow his death. For example, Hadad the Edomite, a royal from Edom who had fled to Egypt during David's reign, returns to become an enemy of Solomon, stirring rebellion against Israel. 1 Kings 11, 14-22. Then Rezin of Zobah, Rezin, a leader from Zobah, establishes himself in Damascus and becomes another adversary, continually harassing Israel. 1 Kings 11, 23 and 25. And then of course there's Jeroboam's rebellion. Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials, rebels against Solomon after a prophecy from the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah prophesies that Jeroboam will rule over 10 tribes of Israel after the kingdom is divided. And Solomon attempts to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam flees to Egypt, where he remains until Solomon's death. Solomon's reign, which began in wisdom and prosperity, ends in decline due to his disobedience and idolatry. After ruling for 40 years, Solomon dies and is buried in the city of David, his father. His son Rehoboam succeeds him, inheriting a kingdom that is on the verge of division and turmoil. 1 Kings 11, 41-43. Now, when comparing the reigns of Saul and David and Solomon, each king had notable strengths and weaknesses that shaped the course of Israel's history. The following is a comparison highlighting one key strength and one significant weakness for each king. So let's take a look. We begin with Saul. Saul's primary strength lay in his role as military leader. He successfully defended Israel from external threats, particularly from the Philistines. And he was able to unite the tribes of Israel under a central leadership for the first time. His military victories earned him respect and helped stabilize Israel during a time of external threats. Saul's greatest weakness was his inability to consistently obey God's commands. His two significant acts of disobedience, first offering a sacrifice without waiting for Samuel, demonstrated his disobedience, and sparing the Amalekite king and livestock against God's command in 1 Samuel 15. This led to God rejecting him as king. His failure to follow divine instruction resulted in the loss of his dynasty and the eventual decline of his reign. We look at David next. David's strength was his deep personal relationship with God. He is described as a man after God's own heart in 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. Throughout his reign, David demonstrated a genuine faith and reliance on God, which led to a significant military victories, including the defeat of Goliath and the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital city. His devotion to God also led to the planning of the temple and also accumulation of the resources necessary to build the temple, which his son Solomon would later build. Despite his spiritual strength, David's personal moral failures, particularly his adultery with Bathsheba and the arranged death of her husband Uriah, marked a serious decline in his reign. This particular sin led to family discord, including the rebellion of his son Absalom. His family suffered from internal strife and this undermined the stability of his kingdom. And then, of course, we have Solomon. Solomon's reign was marked by his extraordinary wisdom, which he famously displayed when resolving disputes. His wisdom led to the expansion of Israel's influence through trade, diplomacy, and the many alliances he made with foreign nations. Solomon's wealth and achievements, including the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, brought prosperity and truly a golden age of peace and development to Israel that it had not enjoyed in the past and would not enjoy in the future either. Solomon's major weakness was his turning away from God due to the influence of his many foreign wives. His idolatry, as he built altars to foreign gods like Ashtoreth and Molech, led to spiritual decline in Israel. His disobedience to God's laws concerning foreign marriages and worship ultimately led to God's judgment, and the judgment was the division of the kingdom and the erosion of the political unity that had been achieved under his father David. And so when we compare the three kings, basically we summarize their strengths. Saul was capable as a military leader who defended Israel from its enemies. David excelled in his faith and deep devotion to God, uniting the kingdom under God's guidance. And Solomon was known for his wisdom, bringing prosperity and a golden age of peace to Israel. These were the strengths of these first three kings. As far as weaknesses are concerned, Saul's disobedience to God resulted in his complete rejection as king. David's moral failures caused family discord and internal stability. And then finally, Solomon's idolatry led to spiritual decline and ultimately divided the kingdom. And so each king displayed a key strength that benefited Israel, but also had a critical weakness that shaped the trajectory of their reigns and their nation. All right, so there's a review and a summary of the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. We're going to continue next time, but I have an assignment for you, as you already know. I want you to reread 1 Kings chapters 1 to 11. Now that you have a lot of the background information, rereading this will hopefully be more edifying for you. And then go ahead and read 1 Kings chapters 12 to 22, and we will cover those chapters in our next lesson. So that's it for today. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.